So some years ago, I came upon an article written by my cousin, Rabbi Twerski in Chicago. I was curious about his discovery of the Tekhelet. I didn't give it a whole lot of credence, and I read his article, and then I came to Eretz Yisrael, and I toured the factory at the Ptil Tekhelet, and I was very, very impressed. I did further research, mostly about 2 points. Point number one was, what is the downside if it's not the real thing? Is there a downside to wearing a colored string on tzitzis if it's not the real tcheles? I am by no means a Paisik, but I have a good library. And it became very clear to me from the different things that I saw that there was really virtually only an upside, and a tremendous upside at that, and virtually no downside, even if it was not the real Tekhelet. It was merely a question of expense. The worst case scenario was a person was spending money, and we know that the Rabbi Shalom gives us a lot of credit for trying to do good things, should that be the case. The vast majority of the research, however, pointed in the opposite direction, whether we're talking about the archaeological research or the research from Sifrei Kodesh, the various points. Recently, they uncovered in German Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's commentary, and that was, much of it is startling in how it points to the Murek's Tekhelet. Then a young man came to Milwaukee, Shua Yankelovich, who is a incredible, bright young man, and he did a presentation in our kollel, and any opposition that was presented to the fact that it could be the real Tekhelet was just shot down immediately. He's an incredibly bright, mamash, a young man at the time. He was in his early 20s, and it became more and more clear that the potential for the kiyum of a mitzvah saseh daraisa was available to us. One big glaring issue that really troubled me at the time was, how do we dare do something that has not been part of the Mesorah of Klal Yisrael over the ages? We live on Mesorah, we thrive on Mesorah, everything we have is on Mesorah. How do we dare veer away from the Mesorah of our ancestors who didn't do this in this way? And how do we come up doing this? Now, it's not totally fair, because I do live chutz l'machane, and it's easy for me, being somebody who lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to be able to do what I want without all the checks and balances of people who live in the big cities like New York, Yerushalayim, and Bnei Brak. So in further looking into that issue of Mesorah, I came upon several different things which I think really shed light on this issue, and I discussed this in some forums in America. Number one, there are mitzvahs that we do differently today than we have done over many of the years. Like perhaps the most glaring example is the mitzvah of tefillin. So while you see the pictures of tefillin today, there is almost nothing similar about our tefillin to the pre-Holocaust tefillin. Tefillin before the war were all made with a piece of hide. The bottom I'm talking about were made of hide that was called dakis. Dakis means it's an extraordinarily thin piece of leather. As a result of that, the most of the tefillin had to be checked at least once a year so that the ribua, this perfect square, would remain intact, because it was such a thin piece of leather, and it also became paper thin and became puzzled very, very easily. The reason that they needed to use dakis was because they did not have the technology to be able to take thick hide and turn it into a perfect box. They simply could not be done. That technology did not exist until after the war. What's more, the only way for them to make tefillin me'ar achas, for it to be that both the front piece and the back piece, the piece that folds under, should be from one piece of leather, was only able to be done with dakis. So comes modern technology, and it allows us now to create tefillin that are gases. What happened to the Messiah? Elamai. There are things where the Rabbi Shalom allows us to perform mitzvahs in a better way, and if we can enhance our mitzvah performance as matayv manoim, that's even better. Why shouldn't we do things better than we can? Certainly, if there's no downside. If someone were to say to us that if you produce tefillin that are gases that you can't be the mekayim the mitzvah of tefillin, versteht, nobody would do it. But here it's an enhancement of the mitzvah. So where there's an enhancement of the mitzvah, and it wasn't possible for it to be done this way or the meaning, had they had the technology before the war, and Reb Chaim Oizer or the other tzaddikim on whichever side of the fence you wanted to look, the technology existed and they didn't do it, then it's taka pircha, then you can't do it. But because the technology didn't exist, so you can't say why didn't they do it. You couldn't do it. It wasn't possible. Now, Baruch Hashem, it is possible. So you can enhance the mitzvah and perform the mitzvah in a much better way. There are many aspects of even the klaf that the tefillin and Sefer Torah are written on. If you lift up a Sefer Torah from pre-war Europe, you can carry it for minutes, perhaps. The Sefer Torah, you ever lift them? They're extremely heavy. Why? Because they didn't have the technology to produce the klaf in a way that was lightweight. You lift up a Sefer Torah today, unless it's a very, very large Sefer, it can weigh under 10 pounds.
So how you make it the connection between the Tekhelet and...
So all of these mitzvahs,
say it again,
all of the mitzvahs that we couldn't do in this enhanced way when our ancestors were doing them, when the tzaddikim of previous generations were doing them, and we now have the ability to do it. Nobody's going to go ahead and say no, because the Divrei Chaim wrote a Sefer Torah on heavy-duty klaf that was a half-inch thick. I'm going to go today and write a Sefer Torah on klaf that's a half-inch thick. It's ridiculous. There's no reason to do that. I'll give you another example. I heard this from my cousin, who said that somebody challenged him about why you're wearing Tekhelet. Your ancestors didn't do it. So he said, my ancestor, he says, when you go to Eretz Yisrael, do you take off trumas and meisers on your vegetables, on your produce? So he said, of course I do. He said, why? Your ancestors didn't do it. He said, my ancestors couldn't do it. They weren't there. He said, exactly. Your ancestors couldn't wear Tekhelet either. It didn't exist. We didn't have access to it. So this argument of Mesorah is an argument that's a faulty argument, because the only time you can use Mesorah as an argument is if they were able to do something and they didn't do it. Now, the fact that we have the ability to do something, despite and they were not able to do it, is a bracha from the Rabbi Shalom. You can't use Mesorah against something that didn't exist. I'll give you another example, although I'm not sure that the analogy is 100% correct. They recently developed a form of black dye that's able to pervade the entire thickness of the ritzua of tefillin. I spoke to Soifrim, who told me that the psul that they have, the greatest frequency of pasal tefillin, is that the ritzuas become, the top layer of the ritzua gets rubbed off, and it's halacha l'meshe Messinai that it has to be black, and if you don't inspect them often enough, you can have pasal tefillin. We just had an episode in Milwaukee. There was a kid who had been putting on tefillin for close to a year, and I happened to be davening in the yeshiva minyan, and right up by the kesher, he had a slit that went right through the entire ritzua. The white was exposed, straight across the entire ritzua, and he had been wearing posel tefillin since the day of his bar mitzvah. Because if they're not black, they're not kosher. So somebody's going to argue the Messiah. So I checked into the did this technology exist? It did not. They were not able to do it. They didn't have the chemicals that was able to go through a piece of leather. Now we have those chemicals, and as a result, we're able to ensure that even if the top layer of a ritzua was to come off, then it'll still be a kosher ritzua. So somebody's going to go argue they didn't do it. It's not a fair argument.
So what about the other blue that the other Hasidim wearing? The Renzin?
The Radzina.
Yeah.
I don't know very much about it.
Yeah, so...
Again, another argument. It's not a totally fair argument. Somebody could ask, did the Radzina not respect Messiah? So first of all, there's several answers. He brings in his sefer, the Radzina brings in his svarim, that he had a Kabbalah that the Koznitz Magid said that before Yemais HaMashiach that the Tekhelet will be revealed. I want to tell you, I think that it's perhaps pointed to in the Ramban. The Ramban, here at the end of Parsha Shlach, says, on the mitzvah of Tefillin, he argues with Rashi. Rashi says here that what's the Uzchatem is called mitzvahs Hashem? How do you remember all the mitzvahs of Hashem? So Rashi writes that the gematria of tzitzis is the 608 Sheish Meis Shemena Chutin Chamish Ksharim. So you have Taryag. Okay, the Ramban does not like that. Ramban said, I don't understand this because the word tzitzis in the Torah is missing the yud, and therefore it's only 590. Says the Ramban, Aval Hazikaron Hu B'chut Tekhelet. Right? The Uschat HaMa'isa, you're going to remember. How are you going to remember Hashem's mitzvahs? You're going to remember it with the strand of Tekhelet. Sheroim is lemida hakoileles hakoil. It points to a midah that is all-inclusive. Shehi bakoil v'tachlis hakoil. Now, obviously he's talking here divrei Kabbalah. U'lechein ha'ma uschatem es koil she mitzvahs Hashem. So he writes here, V'adimyan b'shem gam hagaven tcheles hamares ki berchoikam yiru kulam gaven ahu lefikach nechet tcheles. So he says that tcheles comes from lashon of tichle, of the end of it being tachlis hakoil. So we're now in the days before Mashiach comes. I think that what the Radzina said in the name of the Koshel Tzemagid is alluded to here, that the Uschatem is called mitzvahs Hashem is coming dafka from the Chut Shel Tekhelet, not the Chut Shel Lavam, and that's going to be Meloshin Kalois. That's how the Golus is going to end with the revelation of this mitzvah. I just wanted to also share with you that the Rabbeinu Bechaya in Parshas Shlach writes another very, very powerful thing. First of all, he brings from the Sefer HaBoyer, which is a Sefer Kabbalah. What's the reason for Tekhelet? Says Rabbeinu Bechaya, it's a mashal to a king and his daughter who wanted to go on a trip. Pachadu me'emes hamelach. So they were afraid of danger. So nasalem simanim. So I'm sorry, people were afraid of the king, so he gave them simanim. Pachadu min Abbas, nasna lehem siman. Amru me'ata b'shnei simanim elu Hashem yishmarcha mikol ra yishmar es nafshecha. That Tekhelet is a shmira. There are those who want to quote a Zohar that says that it's ma'ir dinim. The Rabbeinu Bechaya from the Sefer HaBoyer is clearly pointing to the fact that this is a shmira, that it's exactly the opposite. In addition, he writes here above that tzitzis and tchelis are like a lulav and an esrik. And he says, just like a lulav and an esrik are ma'akvin zeh that you can't fulfill the mitzvah without one another, so too tzitzis and tchelis are ma'akvin zeh they are critical to one another. Bizman shoya tchelis motzui. If tchelis is available, Paskins Rabbeinu Bechaya, that just like you can't fulfill the mitzvah of lulav and esrog without having both. If Tekhelet is available, it is ma'akev. Aval achshav, he says, she'en lanu Tekhelet. If we don't have it, then meniach halav and b'lei Tekhelet ki hu ha'ikr. Then he concludes with the words, V'ine ha-Tekhelet hu ha-esrog shenikra hadar. Tekhelet is magnificence, it's splendor. You can see that in the Megillah as well, that it's Ma'od Chatzadik Yotzim of Ne'amelech. What is the Beluvush Tekhelet? Anyway, so he also compares it to Tkiya through a Tkiya Rabbeinu B'chaya, but you clearly see that there are things going on with this mitzvah that are incredibly powerful. The downside is virtually nothing, despite the fact that those who in desperation are grasping at straws to create a problem with the mina knaf. It doesn't apply to the chut shel Tekhelet, that applies to the chut of love, and it doesn't apply to the strand of Tekhelet anyway. So there's virtually, other than expense, there is no downside. It is not an issue of Mesorah because it wasn't available to our ancestors. Baruch Hashem, it is now available to us. Elamai, it's an expense. So you can't, obviously you can't rule on how other people should spend their money, but the people spend a lot of money on mitzvahs. It's a mitzvah that a person can fulfill, all the daylight hours of each day. As Rabbeinu B'chaya says, it's a shmira. So the upside is incredibly great. The downside is a few dollars. And I think it's, in my humble opinion, it is a fabulously worthwhile pursuit. The only thing is that we have to somehow, the stigma issue has to be addressed.
Are you wearing it, Rabbi?
Of course. I am proudly wearing Tekhelet.
See, that's what I wanted from here. I'm proudly wearing a Tekhelet. יופי, אני חושב שיש לנו את זה.
Yeah, that was excellent.
Fantastic.
Very, very good.
I didn't hear this point being addressed on the other. The Mesorah issue,
right.
I think that for Hamish people, the Mesorah issue is the
That's a very nice
is
that's the issue.
the sticking point.
חזק מאוד. יש לך עוד משהו להוסיף?
If anybody has a few $1 million, they should send to me.
Anyway,